Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we are obsessed with creativity. We celebrate story and storytellers, and I try to talk to very interesting people to get the real scoop, not only what makes them tick, but how they see the industries that they operate in. I'm Sean Murphy, your host. I'm an author. I run the Center for Story at Shenandoah University. I founded the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. You can find out more about me at seanmurphy.net. As I always like to say right up front, the best part of the different roles I fill is I do have the opportunity and the honor to be in contact with some really amazing people. And today, as you might imagine, is no exception. This is not our first rodeo, but it is always an absolute pleasure to talk to Jane Friedman. I consider myself decently in the know about things literary and field my share of questions. But whenever I talk to Jane, I'm like Obi-Wan with Yoda, having the opportunity to be with the real master. And I hope our conversation today sheds some light on some of Jane's expertise, but we're probably going to be able to skim the surface. The hardest challenge I have with my most amazing guests is trying to condense page-long bios into like a paragraph soundbite. So I'll do my best. I'm here for it, but trust me, this is the abbreviated version. But Jane has over 25 years of experience in book publishing with expertise in business strategy for both authors and publishers. She's the co-founder and editor of The Hot Sheet, has previously worked for Writer's Digest, the Remarkable Virginia Quarterly Review. In 2023, she was awarded Publishing Commentator of the Year by Digital Book World. Her expertise has been featured literally countless media, but including New York Times, The Atlantic, CNN, The Guardian, Washington Post, NPR, etc. And finally, and I'm not in my home office, I would be holding up her copy, a copy of her book, The Business of Being a Writer, which is the book I most often recommend to anyone looking for insights onto an ever-changing industry. So enough said why I'm excited. Jane, it's always great to see you, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Sean. It's good to be back in conversation with you.
Well, it's always a joy. I guess I'll kick it off by saying I would almost feel remiss to not really get people up to speed on like who you are and what you do, but I'm going to assume that many of the people that follow me know you, partly because I've talked about you so much, but for folks, we'll put this in the blurb after and in the recording link, but you can find out all kinds of stuff at the treasure trove that's janefriedman.com. But I want to use my time wisely as a good Jedi Knight and get some wisdom from the master. So I would say, Jane, the first obvious question right out of the gate, I'll set it up a little bit by saying, I, of course, am obsessed and immersed in all things literary and whatever that might or might not entail. But generally speaking, it seems to me a lot of what I'm reading is bad news. Book industry is struggling it kind of mirrors the rest of the world. The ones that are in or doing well are doing well, but folks that are trying to break in or keep independent ventures afloat, times are really challenging. So I guess my first question would be, what are you seeing in the industry? What are some of the trends, and how are you just feeling in general, maybe compared to last year, or what you think is going to happen in the next year?
If you just look at the industry on a raw performance basis, like all in, not looking at any particular size of publisher or any particular category, publishing is actually doing really well. I know it doesn't feel that way to many people who are both in the trenches, and here I'm thinking of like mid-list authors in particular. Certainly doesn't feel that way to people, knocking on the doors trying to get in.
Yeah.
But in terms of the health of book sales, the health of bookstores, the health of the avid reader or the avid readers of books,
Mm.
both in the United States and in other English language countries. It's still a very good time to be in the business. And it's been that way since we moved into the pandemic. The pandemic was a boon for book sales, and a lot of people expected there to be a kind of a drop off the cliff
Yep.
after the pandemic kind of subsided. But there hasn't been a drop off the cliff. Right now, for 2024, sales could be up over last year, which is pretty remarkable. Now, obviously, I began this answer by saying if you just look at the raw numbers, if you
Right.
start to look at very specific sectors, you start to feel some pain for people. Nonfiction has been a big area of challenge for the last few years. But with the recent election, we may see a resurgence in nonfiction, just like we did after 2016.
Right.
And certainly for children's middle grade specifically, that has been really hard hit. It's really tough if you're an author trying to get established there traditionally.
Mm-hmm.
The industry is just taking on fewer of those books. Now, there are a multitude of reasons for that, but what I would say as encouragement is that none of these feel like permanent situations. Like the publishing industry, like any other industry, it has ebbs and flows, and the trends affect it. There are fashions, and so right now the fashion is romantasy, and books that are spicy. So you'll see a lot of that is driving the success right now, in particular.
Mm-hmm. So that's welcome feedback. Maybe if we drill down a little bit and say, to a certain extent, say genre fiction always has peaks and valleys, but those that again get in the door can do very well. No one would quibble with that. Maybe if we narrow down into the data set and look at literary fiction, and here I include everything from advances to book sales to the possibility of getting the book published. Again, is it that I'm in a smaller pool and a lot of what I'm hearing is so close to the bone that it seems like on balance it's more bad news than good news?
Literary fiction has always been a challenging area ever since I got into the business,
Yeah.
in the late 1990s. I feel like advances have been always modest. And it's always been buttressed by a lot of activity in the nonprofit space, independent presses, university presses. So that's not to say that the biggest publishers don't publish literary fiction, but they tend to be more risk averse. There's only so many of those titles they're going to take a risk on. And sometimes if the authors aren't performing the way they would like, and I don't mean just in terms of sales, but in terms of critical reception, that author may need to find another publisher afterward.
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges with literary fiction is in marketing. It's in the publisher's branding. I think it depends on which sector of publishing we're talking about, but I feel like particularly in the literary sector, there has been some trouble with marketing and branding as people move away from the recognized tastemakers of literature. Like the New York Times Book Review just doesn't sell the amount of books that people think it does, unfortunately. And
Right.
so when you're relying on these prestige outlets, of which there are fewer and fewer, I might add,
Yeah.
because book review sections have been closing for years, that makes it
Right.
tougher to spread the word about these types of books. I don't think anyone should lose hope. We've seen, for example, the rise of Substack. That's complicated. I don't think it's entirely a great thing, but it tends to be prevalent in the literary community, and it does have very powerful marketing features that I think are helpful with addressing some of these challenges.
So, one of the things that I'll age us both, or maybe the better way to frame that is we've been doing this for so long, but
Yeah.
I remember talking to you over a decade ago, and you again have always been on I'd say the front burner in terms of what we now refer to, well, correctly, but now branding is everything, whether you're selling shoes or whether you're selling a book. But as it relates to branding, again, for those of you watching now, forgive me because this is kind of common, but for people that aren't or are trying to kind of get their head around what I would say is a shifting landscape. I would say even from when I started out in the mid to late 90s, even if it was a myth, and I think in some regards it was, but the advice was write the best book you can, and then you find an agent, and maybe the book sells and maybe it doesn't. But the author's role was to be a writer, and a lot of what I'm reading now and have experienced myself is not only, and this is I think so the conversation 10 years ago that you and I were having was it's very difficult if you're going to be aloof and not have a social media presence, not have your own website, not blog. And I think most people would agree with that at this point if they didn't then. But the other thing I'm hearing now, which I don't have any fault with because it's a capitalist model, but agents and editors are not only looking for a good book and someone with a presence, but what kind of following do you have on Substack? What kind of built-in audience do you have? And some of the cynical feedback I get is, so what are they doing? And I guess the answer is they're publishing the book and promoting it. But, now it seems like the list of things a writer needs to do to even have a shot. Again, I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just challenging. But is that also a pessimistic take, or do you agree that yeah, to have a chance in a very competitive landscape, you better check a lot of different boxes where maybe 25 years ago, if you wrote a good book, you had a better chance.
I think, if we go back 25 years ago or like somewhere in the 80s or 90s, there were only so many ways to push a book out into the world, and the publisher could do all of that for you. And the way they pushed that book out into the world was basically distribution through retail, through libraries, making sure that the people who recommend books knew about it, doing all of the recognized prizes and those prestigious outlets that I mentioned.
Yep.
But today, the media landscape is so much more fragmented. And so I'm kind of going back to the earlier points I made. It gives the author, or it gives the individual, yes, it gives them more responsibility and burden, but they're also the ones with the power. So I don't always agree with people who feel like this burden has been put on authors in this unfair, unreasonable way. The world has changed. You have the former CEO of Penguin Random House, Madeline McIntosh. She left a year or two ago. She started a publisher called Authors Equity. And part of her explanation for their new model of working, which I won't get into now, is that the publishers no longer have the same power to get a book seen as an author does, which is a remarkable thing for someone at the most powerful publisher in the world to say.
Yes.
And so I don't think publishers like this any more than the authors do. That's okay. So now, all of that said, I do think authors sometimes misread what the publishers want or what the agents are expecting. Like, so often the cynical people will say, I'm not going to go dance on TikTok. I can't get 1 million followers on Substack. Like, they'll boil it down usually to something some performance they have to do on social media.
Right.
But that's not really what people are looking for necessarily. Like, yeah, everyone likes the people with the big numbers,
Sure.
but especially in the literary community, that's not necessarily what sells books at all.
Right.
I think, and here I also want to be really clear, the expectations for novelists, fiction writers, poets, very different than from the nonfiction space. Okay, so for nonfiction, you need to have some sort of authority, expertise, platform that will support the book that you're writing. With fiction writers, I don't think anyone's looking for that massive online following right out of the gate. Like, it's your first book, you're unpublished, you're unknown, because you can only become known through people actually reading the work that is so far unpublished.
Right.
So what are they looking for then? If not that I think this leads to the final decision at all. I think the decision is still made based on the story, the work itself. They're just looking for engagement with the community of people who are ultimately going to support that book. And engagement takes a lot of different forms. Like, it could mean being active as you are in your community, speaking at 1455, being a volunteer at 1455. There are nonprofits like yours in almost every significant city in the country. It could mean just being a patron at your local library and bookstore, attending the events, meeting the authors, going to conferences, being part of writing organizations. Sometimes the shorthand for this is called literary citizenship. So being a good literary citizen, because ultimately when it comes time to launch the book, it's not really the number you have on your social media account that determines the success. It's whether or not you have forged relationships in a community, which may be represented in social media, and whether those people are going to come out and support you. So I think I do think it's always been a myth that a writer just, was up alone on the mountain and then, sent their book down to be published and they stayed on the mountain.
Yeah.
But I think most people, they want to be engaged with the community. They just maybe don't know what that looks like. And if you can show them some other role models, people who do this well and they're not compromising their values, I think they start to maybe loosen a little bit on what it might mean to support their book.
I really appreciate that distinction that you laid out, but between fiction and nonfiction in particular. Maybe the issue is, and this is where my head's been, as I navigate, hearing these personal stories, looking at the trends, acknowledging reality. I think it's both good news and bad news from my perspective that maybe it's a bigger issue than literary or academia. And the simple fact of the matter is unsatisfying as this is to propose, there have never been more platforms and ways to get one's work into the world in any number of different ways. But the side effect of that is there's more content out there. So the bigger issue is no matter what your agent or publisher or author is doing, you are competing with an absolute tsunami of content, whether it's good, bad, or just, whatever. We are all consuming more. So I think that's where people get overwhelmed and think, well, how do I navigate this? And, I guess that was going to lead to my big question for you, which is, so I'll let you respond to that if you want, but I want to call specific attention to a recent post that you put up. There's no such thing as a good editor, good agent, good publisher, good publicist, good marketer. So I want to acknowledge that and high five you, but also say to, again, anyone that doesn't already follow you, this is the essence of Jane. It's not just that she's an expert. It's not just that she is always giving sound advice, but she really cares and she takes the time to tell the truth, but always offer encouragement. And look for the slivers of opportunity that might exist. But I love how you laid out in your very guru friendly, kind way. There's no shortcut. There's no hack. If you had it, if I had it, or if anyone could attain it, everyone would be doing it. Everyone would be wealthy. But maybe talk a little bit about what prompted you to write that. I'm sure some of it is because you get these questions every day, but maybe just unpack what you wrote a little bit and how that's kind of a window into how you interact with your audience and try to guide them.
Yeah, so that post was brewing for a very long time because just as background, which I mentioned a little bit in that article, I have a resource list, I have a recommendations page, and I try to make it available very publicly so people don't have to ask for it, because I do get asked constantly, can you tell me which editor to hire, which publicist to hire, which agent I should pitch my book to, who are the good, quote, good publishers, so I avoid the, quote, bad ones. And I totally understand this because we're kind of sadly in shark infested waters in the writing and publishing community. There are a lot of bad actors and predators out there. I get just as many people coming to me saying, I got taken advantage of. I paid money for a service that was really bad. And so people tricked and swindled. And it's so sad to say, but these horrible services, these bad actors have only increased over time.
Yeah.
For example, if you self-publish today, it doesn't take but a week or two before you're suddenly getting calls from people who say they can help you turn your book into a movie, just pay them $500, And so I get the emails from people saying, is this legit? No, anyone who's calling you saying
Right.
no. All right, but I'm getting off track here. So all that to say, I understand the anxiety that people have. They don't want to get mixed up with a bad operation.
Yeah.
However, even if you get into a good relationship with a good publisher or a good agent, that's no guarantee that things will work out to your advantage, that the relationship won't sour. And I also can't recommend the perfect whatever for everybody. A lot of this is just and hugely subjective and variable. And there are
Yeah.
certainly people you know, because of my reputation, there are very few people who are going to come out and publicly say, I had a bad experience working with Jane Friedman. But there, I'm sure, because there's no one who, has 100% track record, there are people who've had bad experiences with me, but you don't often hear about the bad. This affects just more than me. And so, in other words, you have to recognize that you can do everything perfectly and still not get the outcome you want. And that's how writing is, that's how publishing is. There are just no guarantees. So partly I'm trying to take the pressure off, reduce the anxiety, but also encourage people, um, to what to give everyone grace. There's and also, even if you do, I don't know that I pointed this out in the article, but even if you do make a mistake, if something does go bad, you can recover. Like, there is not a career ending mistake in any of these things for the most part. Like, there are people who've lost a lot of money, and I feel bad about that. But you can recover.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And, I would just add the stories I hear, I would say on balance, I've heard more anger and disappointment from writers that have had reputable
Right.
publishers or agents. And I'm such a small fry speaking to you, but I feel a burden of responsibility because I feel like when we get real about some of these topics, it invariably sounds really pessimistic or
Yeah.
very discouraging. Like, hey, even some of the best authors I know and most successful, and I have to do that. I'm not being sarcastic, but successful or what we would consider, many of us would consider from the outside looking in, like that person's made it. And you hear their horror stories or how little money they're making.
Right.
Um, for me, what I always kind of end up at, like my North Point or whatever, is yeah, it's fraught with rejection and failure. There's no guarantees, but that also, in a weird way, is what's going to guarantee that you're in it for the right reasons. Because if you're doing it to somehow figure out what people who've been writing for centuries haven't figured out, but you're going to figure out the hack, you're probably not doing it for the right reasons, and you're definitely not in it for the long haul. But even when I say that, I hear myself implying you better be ready to wait for 30 years. And of course, that's not the case. But most writers you talk to will say it's all about persistence, faith, and finding joy in the work.
Yeah, I always underline that last part. I think there's one of the anecdotes I like to tell now in talks is that the famous tennis player, is it Djokovic? So he was interviewed by a journalist, and the journalist asked him, how can you stay on top of your game for this long of a period? I don't follow the sport, so I can't tell you why his reign is remarkable, but apparently it is. And he
Yeah.
said, well, I enjoy hitting the ball. And the journalist looked at him like, what? Like, are you telling me the people you play against don't like hitting the ball? That's ridiculous.
Right.
And he said, well, no, you can tell very clearly there are people who are playing who don't like playing. And I see that a lot among writers. And there's so many reasons for that. There's a lot of, I keep talking about status and prestige throughout this conversation, but there is a lot of status and prestige wrapped up in being an author, having a particular type of publisher or a particular type of agent. And sometimes people focus on that to their detriment, and they forget about why they even wanted to write a book in the first place or be a writer.
Yeah, and I've seen, I guess I could say we, but I'll speak for myself, see day in and day out people that for either their own reasons or definitely the wrong aspirational reasons go down the rabbit hole of social media, become, Twitter raconteurs and do build a following and do have engagement. And I always want to ask them, especially the ones that say they're unhappy, are you putting your energies into your work, or are you putting your energies into who might want to receive your work? And you're building a brand as someone with pithy, short, observations, as opposed to trying to engage people in your larger works. I don't know if there's a way out of that. I guess as a writer myself, I've always looked at that as the more people that are, spending time on social media, the less competition at the end of it in terms of people that are getting the books written. Because I also think looking at any of this as competition is, of course, is wrong, but it's also a dead end. But yeah, I mean, do you encourage, what do you tell people about balance on social media? Because it's like, it's the necessary evil, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Less is more.
It's such a difficult topic, especially now because of political polarization and the ways that it can have other damaging effects. It can get very it's there's a lot of conflict there, and it can suck away your emotional energy. I've been on social media now for 16 years. So I do feel like I've learned how to deal with it in a way that manages like the emotional repercussions, and I've learned how to turn it off or to step away. I do think like I'm still on social media most days as part of my business. I do feel like it's part of the service I provide to be part of conversations and also to push back on some of the bad information that I see floating around. I'm not going to be able to push back on all of it, but I do want to be kind of the voice of reason and to tamp down the anxiety when I see an opportunity. So as far as the balance, I would say I do think it exercises the writing muscles in an interesting way. Of course, it depends on what sort of writer you are.
Yeah.
But just in the way that like I do some of the shorter form, like Threads or X, it can be a little bit of like poetry. And I imagine there are some poets rolling in their grave now. But being able to express something succinctly and with just the right words, I think it's a nice writing exercise. So people who can see that sort of benefit in it, I think, and also often if I have a series of really good posts on an issue, I will then take it and use it as the foundation of something else. So a longer piece that's more well thought through. Feedback that I get on social media is also really helpful because I can see my own blind spots. People ask questions and I realize, oh, the way I'm expressing this isn't great. I need to rethink. So for me, it's really good. This is because I'm in nonfiction, it's probably a little different, but it's a really great source of market research for me that keeps me coming back to it. And I've also, if you look back at my long history on social media, I've found 2 business partners through social media. I've struck up countless relationships that way. And so even as that social media picture has grown darker and darker over time, and I've had my days when I'm like, am I done now? Like I feel like I might be done. I still find it of use. I would recommend for writers who are feeling distracted or like it's a time or energy drain, just pick the one place that you're most comfortable. And I really only feel like it has to be one place. There are some people who spread themselves too thin, and then they ask me, how do you balance it all? And I say, well, what are you doing? And they say, well, I'm on Threads and Substack and LinkedIn and YouTube. And I'm like, okay, whoa. Maybe narrow it and start to engage with some other people that you actually find interesting. Like you would want to sit down and have a coffee or a cocktail with this person. Like those are the folks you should be looking for. It is like an open door to some of the most fascinating people on the planet. And then just put really strong guardrails around when you're going to be there. So for me, it's basically during business hours, because for me, it's a very business oriented activity. And then in the evenings, in the mornings, no way. That is not the way for me to either begin or end the day. And I don't understand people who look at their phones when they wake up. That's like, wow, I learned my first year of iPhone use not to do that. I'm not trying to moralize, but like I don't know how people do it.
Right. Yep. So again, thank you for that. I think you've really kind of distilled, an entire workshop's worth of wisdom into that response. And it's not surprising to me because, again, in the conversations I have, what I always seemingly come back to when we're talking about the big picture is there really are a few truisms that, not surprisingly, over decades hold true because they're true. But finding balance and leaning into environments and curating the kind of culture that works for you, it is one's responsibility, but one also can control that to a certain extent. So I love the way you put a positive spin. Almost sounds like you're not spinning, but you're showing the positive side of there is a lot of interesting ways that we can have access to and interact with fascinating people, our own literary communities, and filter out the noise and home in on opportunities to learn, be engaged, keep the saw sharp for your own like
Yes.
poetic observations and ways you can learn to write and relate. And that leads me to, one of the
Well,
things.
hold on. I want to add one more thing you just reminded me of,
Sure,
because
please.
it perhaps obvious, but when I suggest it to people, they feel nervous about doing this. Please mute and block people that aren't serving your purpose on social media. And even if they're your friends, I have blocked and muted even friends, like close friends. And they know it because I've told them. Like I can't, I'm just like, I love you,
It's,
but I can't do that at your level every day. No.
yeah.
And so I think you have to be willing to curate the experience. It takes some time, but you can curate it so you're only getting the things that feed your creative practice and mute and block the rest.
Yeah, I mean, basically, you're advocating for this balance of setting boundaries, but not shutting oneself off to the good stuff.
Right.
So I do think maybe younger or less experienced people need to hear this. That at least in this conversation, neither of us are saying or have ever said, "Yeah, if you want to be a serious writer, get off social media and don't worry about all this branding crap." The reality is, as you've just explained, like there's a lot of good there, but I think it's important for people to either remember or be reminded that just like powerful forces are curating our experiences, we
Yeah.
still do have tons of our own opportunities to take the curation back. And whether
Yes.
it's through blocking or following, there
Yeah.
are ways that you can kind of narrow that world that seems very
Yeah.
overwhelming, whether we're talking literary, political, or just the flood of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to. And I will say in the last couple days, I have muted a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, and I think again at the end of the day, what I've asked people that have talked to me about feeling overwhelmed, first of all, I share, I certainly feel their pain, but I also ask them with a lot of empathy, like how much of this is in your control versus out of your control. Like if you're worrying about the state of the world or the state of your career, I'm here for it and I'll mostly listen. But if you're talking about the things that you and I are discussing and you're trying to be an artist, a little less TV, a little less social engagement. It's like, what do you, if you measure these things in terms of months or years, do you want to look back on, say, the last year or the last 5 years and say, I worked on my novel, or I cultivated 30,000 Twitter followers? Either of those could end up being very worthwhile end results, but maybe ask yourself or always check yourself, like, am I going to be happy in 3 years at this Twitter account? Or am I going to be happier with a finished product? Or the superhumans amongst us that are able to do both, like
Yeah.
Stephen King, for just out of to take one example. Like there are those amongst us that seem very engaged and get their work done.
Yeah, there was a piece published just today, actually, by Oliver Berkman. He wrote a terrific book called 4,000 Weeks. It's about time management for mortals. He is not going to put pressure on you to be more productive. It's actually the opposite. Um, and 4,000 weeks, the title is that's the approximate number of weeks you have in a lifetime. So anyway, he sent out a newsletter today titled "How Not to Freak Out About the U.S. Election."
Yep.
And he's not a political person at all. That's not what his newsletter is about. And he even has a preface on it that says, look, I'm probably never going to write about this topic again, But, drawing on what I've learned about productivity and creativity and, getting along in this world, here are 3 tips. And one of the tips has to do with basically limiting social media. But another one I think also just as important, because I think it's another big distraction especially for writers who do research and are curious people. I think be careful with your mainstream media consumption as well, and think about when and where do you want to consume the news, and is that going, and look at if it's subverting your creative process.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. So of course, Jane, I would be remiss, if not outright negligent. I think the through line, because when I first met you, I mean, I was a writer before, during, and after our introduction, but I love that I first talked to you kind of in a formal setting as a tech analyst. I've talked to you as a writer of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. I've talked to you as a nonprofit founder and event, community organizer. But one of the things that's been a through line in our conversation, and I think it is a societal thing, is technology. It's unavoidable. It's always both impacting and reacting to what's happening in the business and artistic worlds. But one of the many things I've always admired about you is you are, if I may say, an old soul, a very calm presence, but you also lean in, have always been incredibly open-minded and on the cutting edge in terms of being aware of what's going on, embracing being able to explain to people, here's how some of these newfangled things are helpful, here's what to avoid. So I want to get your present take on tech, but of course I would be remiss if I didn't say an AI, because every conversation in 2024 has to at least name check. But I know that you in particular have some both personal experience and some very informed opinions on the good, the bad, and in some cases, very ugly.
Yeah, if you talk about tech today, it's basically talking about AI, at least in the writing and publishing community, because it's the number one concern, fear, opportunity. And I had my own experience, which I think you alluded to, where several books, well, almost half a dozen, appeared on Amazon that had my name on them, but these were not books I had written. They were really long books, like they were normal sized books on topics that I'm known for. But it was pretty obvious they were AI generated. And so that created something of a media firestorm, because I was one of the first people to kind of experience this type of fraud through AI use. Now, I did get the books taken down. You're not going to find them today, thankfully. And things have progressed so much since then. So it's been about 1.5 years since that occurred. And we're in this really awful gray period as far as the law, as far as what best practices are going to be, the standards, transparency. And so that, of course, just feeds on the anxiety and fear that writers have, because everyone's kind of like, well, not entirely sure what's happening. We don't know what we're going to do. We're not quite willing to do that. But, and so everyone's just tearing their hair out, trying to figure out if they're about to be taken advantage of, or if they're going to lose their career in the future because of AI, et cetera. So what I'll say is that I don't think authorship is dead. I don't think authors will be replaced by AI. Yes, there are going to be the so-called efficiencies, where some work's going to get done much faster. There might not be as much need for humans to do like copy editing. There might be a good deal of audiobook narration that's from a synthetic voice. Translation, I don't think translators will be out of jobs, but I think we're going to have more translated literature, and we're going to need translators to work with AI, and it'll become more affordable. Right now, translation is so expensive. That's why there's so little of it in the United States. So you're going to have some good results and bad results, as you have with so many technological developments. When I talk with writers about this, like, again, I'm always trying to ease anxiety, because if you're in that state of fear or anxiety, you're just paralyzed. You don't feel like you can take the next step. And we need to get rid of that if we can. Like, you're never going to know the future. You have to still be able to step forward despite the uncertainty. So, what I try to show are all of the conflicted feelings that people had when word processors came out. So, this was like around the 80s. And, there were people saying it was the devil, it was going to ruin writing, it would allow people to write who shouldn't be. And my favorite is a New York Times column, like a woman who did some sort of like business writing or business column for other women, saying that the word processor was going to decimate women's careers because now men would type their own documents.
Wow.
Like, oh no, what will the women do now if they can't type what the men are writing?
Yeah.
So we can't see the future here. There obviously everyone's making predictions. Everyone pretends that they know what's going to happen, but no one really knows. And so we're just kind of figuring it out as we go along. I will say that, like on the legal end, there is this original sin of the AI tools being trained on copyrighted works. There hasn't been any compensation for that. There are lawsuits underway by the Authors Guild, the New York Times, and other companies.
Sure.
But at the same time, and I think this should be seen as a positive, there are also licensing agreements being struck with all sorts of media companies and publishers where the AI, the model makers are saying, okay, we're going to pay for the quality content. The trouble right now is no one knows what to value it at. So some of these figures are just kind of being invented out of thin air. So when a writer asks, well, what are my books worth? Everyone's kind of like, I don't know. we're still figuring it out.
Right.
But I do think there are going to be collective licensing agencies that authors can that they'll want to sign up with regardless, to either say, yes, you can train on my work, or no, you cannot. And then we'll go from there. And for people who are curious about what is an example of one of these agencies, go look for Created by Humans. It was founded by the CEO of Scribd, which is the digital reading service. So we'll see. Again, it's still so early, and I do think a lot has to be figured out by the courts before we're going to begin to have clarity on exactly what the standards are for publishers, authors, and everyone else, frankly.
Yeah. I mean, so bravo. Thank you. I'm going to give you the opportunity to play a role you never need to play or have ever played with me, but basically like the head mistress or the principal. I'm going to be the smart ass student and make a very blunt claim, and you can either say that's by and large true, or no, here's what you're missing. What I've
Okay.
told people, so what you just said, I mean, no question. But some of those issues are for established authors, people with a
Yeah.
platform, people that have made money at writing. My basic take, which of course, and I've talked about this a lot, there's tons of nuance and there's a lot of different things that need to shake out. But what I've said to people is generally, people want to discover original work, whether that's editors, agents, or readers. That's what's always been consistent from cave drawings till e-readers. You probably shouldn't worry too much about AI stealing your work if you've never published anything. Worry about the work itself, and AI is not going to replace creativity because it can't.
Yeah. I agree with that 100%. Yes.
Okay. So I am grateful because I feel pretty strongly about that, understanding that, I mean, you just laid it out, but some of the issues are more legal
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
procedural and very serious on a societal and industry level. But in terms of creativity, I kind of make the case that we've never needed authentic voices more. And this
Yeah.
recent like fake news, misinformation, like,
Mm-hmm.
well, who do we turn to in times like that? Artists, people whose
Yeah.
platform is basically, I'm probably not making money at this and I'm still putting this much time into the research and the execution. You probably can trust it whether you like it or not. So I feel like artists are inoculated because you can always follow the money. And when there isn't any, you know that there's no scam there.
Yeah.
So, okay. So we can high five. We covered AI. Um, I think that the only question, I don't want to let you off the hook because you gave a pretty positive, very refreshingly positive take on the industry. But
Mm-hmm.
I know you've had both direct experience with the lit mag industry, and that's of course also ever changing and
Yeah.
evolving. Um, I feel like there's a similar trajectory in that from personal experience being published in them, running an emag for 1455, it's like having a blog. You can do this cheaper than ever before. You don't need to print, you don't need to disseminate, you can do all these things. But the reality is we're seeing great lit mags fold. We're seeing a lot of independent endeavors calling it quits. And I know some of that's bandwidth, some of it is engagement, some of it's the info overload. But I'm not super bullish on the state of lit mags. I mean, do you have any reaction to that? And is it just that it's being supplanted by Substack and blogs? And there's a lot of,
Yeah.
I see the positive, but I just want to acknowledge that some of the old paradigms are going away.
I've always been very tough on literary magazines, probably because that was my first publishing job in college, was on a literary magazine. And then of course I worked for one for a couple years. So I feel like, I know the strengths and the weaknesses and the foibles. And I feel like literary magazines, unfortunately, year after year, decade after decade, still lean into their worst tendencies, which is we look for great writing or we want to publish great literature, and they don't have any other bigger mission outside of that. And so when you start to line up the literary journals, even if they're some of the top ones in the country, and you put them all side by side and you ask what differentiates these, it's really hard to say
Right.
what differentiates them. Now, I ended up at the Virginia Quarterly Review because at the time, and I think this is still the case, it was very different. It was one of the few journals that you could say that, like, I understand what that journal stands for. And that was because of a very particular editor who transformed it, and it has remained transformed. Um, I do think when you get into, I want to say about the numbers, I have never been clear on if the number is growing or declining. In some regard, literary journals are like weeds; they just keep growing,
Yeah.
even as others are killed.
Right.
And the cost to start one is pretty low if you're not printing it. And also, I think there are lots of idealistic writing students, and they're always starting journals and they're always closing, and all of this is like just part of what happens. It's
Sure.
not, for me, neither good nor bad. It's the literary community.
Yeah.
Um, but I do think Substack has inserted a really interesting dynamic into this, which is you now have people like individuals who arguably have what I would call good taste, whatever you want to say that is, or they know how to curate a really interesting experience, and it stands for something. And that to me is what literary journals should be doing, whether they're digital or print. So an example I will give is Sari Botton's Oldster. You can just tell by the name what that publication is about. It's not for old people, and it's not about old people, but it's about the intersection of culture and age, and how we think about age and aging, regardless of how old you are. And so for that publication, she has various departments or columns. She has outside contributors. She pays those contributors. For all intents and purposes, it is a literary journal. It
Right.
operates with subscriptions. I don't know if she has advertising or sponsors, but I bet she could. And she makes a decent amount of money off of it. Like, she's openly said, this is the most money I've made from my writing,
Oh,
maybe ever.
yep.
Um, but it's because she's curated something that I think people want, that people need, and it produces really genuine, interesting conversations. So I would tell anyone who's at a literary journal, who is listening to this, who wants to start one, who used to be at one, be more interesting with what you're standing for. Rather, it has to be about, to me today, given how much competition there is, you have to stand for something that's going to attract people who are like-minded and want to explore that issue or problem with you through great writing.
Totally. And I don't have anything to add to that. I will supplement by saying I think that this also connects some threads we've talked about just today, which is people that are looking for how to find that balance between wanting authenticity, somehow getting more direct access to artists that they admire, the reciprocal desire of many storytellers to have an engagement with their audience that maybe wasn't possible in the 20th century. There is a pretty sweet spot I'm seeing in Substack that it's also, dare I say it, as a big critic of late stage capitalism, but it's capitalism that works in the sense that what's on the table is very transparent. If you want to subscribe to this, you're supporting me by doing so, but I then have the obligation to give you content that is worth being paid for. But there's no bait and switch, and you have a comment section. Like, it seems to synthesize the technologies we talk about, the pressures and stresses, and seems to be a nice itch scratching mechanism for both reader and writer in a way that even blogs didn't quite
Yeah.
satisfy. And then the
Yeah.
process of discoverability, because you're in an environment, unlike, say, Twitter, where generally it's art, culture, and writing
Yes.
lovers that are congregating. I'm extraordinarily optimistic about Substack. And for me, the only drawback of both operating one and subscribing to a million is it compounds the problem I've had in the 21st century, which is, and forgive me, anyone that follows me, can't just great face, but I say this all the time, but it's true. Without question, I read more than I ever have. I mean, by orders of
Yeah.
magnitude, but I read less books, and I'm always trying to balance.
Yeah.
But I'm reading so many good Substacks. That's just taken the place of maybe a novel. But the point being, for that long-winded, is that there's a lot of great content out there, and there is something special about feeling like you have a more intimate relationship with some
Yes.
of these amazing people.
Yeah, I'm glad you used that word, the intimate relationship, because I think some of the tradition of literary journals is what it has a bit of a standoffish quality to it that I don't know that has ever been shed. Like, we, the editors in the tower, are going to select the best writing. Like, and it always there was so much distance there, and there also it's all conflated with ideas of status and prestige and gatekeeping, and you don't get that sense from Substack publications.
Yeah, and I think also the authenticity thing, because that almost can be like a brand, a buzzword, but we're talking about the literal definition of authenticity. And I think of George Saunders. I mean, he
Mhm.
teaches, he has a wide readership, but it's clear he's in it because he really does enjoy
Yeah.
the engagement, answering questions, being his guru self. But there's obviously other authors that, whether it's they're introverted or extroverted or neither, don't want any part of that. But it's like that's not the path for them. But for
Yeah.
people that want more, there are so many of these opportunities baked in. And I'm glad in return that you use the word gatekeeper, because I think that's a big aspect of this. And it reminds me, I had jotted this down when I was preparing for our chat, because I don't think I've ever mentioned this to you. And it's not a great anecdote, but it happened at the Virginia Festival of the Book, and I always associate us. I think we first met
Yes.
in Charlottesville. So I was moderating a panel of literary agents, and just coincidentally or not, it was two younger, a male and a female, neither white, so young and not from the old school. And then the third person was a very established, I won't say older, but a more mature woman, white, from a very prestigious firm. And you're prepared for these kinds of questions, but someone in the audience said, I'm trying to navigate, all this stuff, and I'm trying to figure out social media and writing a good book, and do you have any advice on how to build a platform? And the two other agents were very encouraging, very real, very genuine. And this woman kind of waited her turn and shrugged her shoulders and said, well, I mean, whatever, but write good work and it'll rise to the top. And you could just feel the hush in the room. And it was all I could do to not kind of be like, that's ridiculous. Like, do you realize how like, why would you be on this panel unless you were here to have people kiss the ring? Like, what are you even doing here? If that's the best you're going to offer. Like, that was terrible advice in the 20th century, because we know that it was very heavily tilted for all the wrong reasons toward white men. So the best work
Yeah.
never risen to the top. I think we,
Yeah.
of course, agree over time. We see like a Moby Dick that didn't do well in 1850, but we now appreciate that was a good book. Yes, quality will endure. But what would you have said you were on that panel? Or what did you say hearing me tell you that again? I know
Oh my
that's not a great
God.
story. We've all have those, but that one
Yeah.
always sticks in my craw as why I find you so refreshing and why the literary community is so important. Not to give people false hope, not to float people, and pump them up, but to be kind, to try to help, to try to steer them away from bad ideas, etc.
Yeah. The cream rises to the top is one of the greatest lies that has ever been told in publishing. And I have to imagine it's true for other industries as well. It's not just writing and publishing. And I say that with some humility because when I first started out, like any creative writing student, I did feel like that I was told or maybe it was strongly implied that was how it worked. And, you know, you spend 5 minutes in the business and you realize that's nonsense. Um, there are a million reasons why great work is overlooked. And I'm not saying that necessarily like it's a crapshoot or that quality doesn't matter. That's not what I mean. Just
Right.
that there are market considerations and luck and timing and advocacy and also I think one of the things that I try to find I try to find ways to tell writers this in a lot of different ways, but you do have agency. You do have power to make things happen in your writing career, and you don't want to surrender your agency to a publisher, to an agent, to a publicist, to whomever you think is going to make your career for you, the make it or break it moment when you're pitching at a conference. No, you do not want to look at any one figure or any one moment in that way. It's one step among many, and you do have to continually advocate for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the essence of it. And I think that's a great note to close on, which is in my experience, the people that have the biggest platforms, the most success, the most admired figures, almost without exception, are the most generous, kind, and it's partly because they're great people, as folks meeting you for the first time today are seeing. But I think it's also because there's this inherent recognition and understanding. There's so much of this that is based on luck, timing, good fortune. And it's because it's such a difficult, competitive industry that those that have some measure of success or opportunity usually feel obliged to pay it forward. And I think that is always what gives me hope. And rather than focus on all the negatives, which, as you point out, is true in the literary industry and is true of life, focusing on curating the areas of influence is one way to stay above despair and cynicism.
Yeah, well said.
So, Jane, that is why I look to you as one of my sources of light. I know so many other people do. And again, I wish I'm definitely at fault for not having a copy, but I'll make sure this isn't the promo. But of course, the business of being a writer is close to a 21st century creative Bible as anyone can have. So I will say it. Talk about the smallest like payback. I recommend it all the time. So if I've helped sell a few of those, you can't even thank me because it's like the least I can do. But for folks feeling like, oh, wow, Jane's amazing. Where do I start? JaneFriedman.com. Duh. And you'll be pleasantly surprised at the layers and depths of free resources and links and things you can learn. But buying that book, no matter where you are in your journey, is going to be very helpful. So, Jane, it's always my tremendous pleasure. Always learn so much from you. But I think what I take away from all these conversations is whatever we're doing in life, we do it with kindness and joy, and the rest does tend to figure itself out.
I think so, yes. Thank you,
All
Sean.
right. Well, you be well until we meet again. We'll continue to praise and worship you from the sidelines. You really are a bright light, and I think that's more important than ever in a world that is not less complicated, less scary. So thank you for all the great work you do. Thank you all for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Reminder: this is the podcast where we love creativity, we celebrate storytellers. We want to talk to people who can enlarge our minds, give us inspiration. So if you're one of those people or know one of those people, send them our way. Go to SeanMurphy.net. And always as a reminder, buy a book, subscribe to a Substack, share something on social media, help lift up the artistic community because they need your support. And if we aren't going to do it, no one will. So be well, and we will see you soon. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.